And welcome back to Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Mike Pache. Thanks again for joining us on really this fast-paced, newsy Friday. We'll continue to do so throughout the afternoon and evening as we get ready for the joint news conference for President Trump, President Putin. Again, this Alaska summit just getting underway here. But we want to continue to bring you the coverage and really some insight and analysis ahead of this meeting. So let's bring in our next guest to help break it all down. This is Josh Shifrinson, Associate Professor for the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Josh, thanks so much for joining us here on really this historic day. And it feels like there's so much anticipation and really build up to this meeting, because this war has really been going on for quite some time.
You're exactly right. This war has been going on for over 3 years, approaching almost 4 years now. It's really been stalemated for most of that time. And there's been stillborn efforts over time and space to kind of bring this thing to a conclusion. President Trump has made this a signature piece of his time in office. And hopefully by bringing the two presidents together, we can break the logjam and really make some progress towards a stable deal.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. But Josh, what do you think the outcome is going to be? I mean, the odds here that we see something substantial coming from this meeting?
No, I think the odds of there being kind of a final arrangement at this meeting, something substantial in that way, are pretty low. I think the best we can hope for is an agreement to continue talking, number one, a process that will bring the Ukrainians, perhaps other Europeans, into the conversation, number two, and finally, some kind of off ramp for the United States and for Russia both, so that they avoid the prospect of a continuing confrontation over what's really a bloody stalemate. So I think prospects of continuing the negotiation would be the best possible outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about just the optics here of this meeting, where we have the U.S. and Russia conducting these talks, but no Ukraine representation.
Right. That's certainly not good optics on the one hand, because you certainly do want the Ukrainians, whose homeland, after all, has been invaded, at the table. My understanding, though, is that President Trump and President Putin are trying to create a framework so that the Ukrainians can join in the conversation going forward. And it's understandable, right? If you were to say to President Putin, hey, we're going to have a talk with Zelensky, but not invite you, you would not expect him to agree to it either. This is a good way of moving the ball forward, similar to how we ended the Vietnam War, for example. But it doesn't commit any side, and of course, the Ukrainians will eventually need to be part of the conversation.
Just showing video from just moments ago of President Trump and Putin. They're on the red carpet, and really the eyes of the world watching these two come down the aisle here, and really the tarmac area. And now, with all the buildup, now the pomp and circumstance is over. Do you think there will be some pressure from President Trump and the U.S. to, at the very least, maybe stop some of the attacks and the missile launches at these schools that we have seen Russia do, at hospitals? I mean, what's the thinking there?
Yes. So obviously, I'm not privy to what's going on in the White House, but I have to expect, at a minimum, if you're going to bring the Ukrainians to the bargaining table, look, their front line is weakening. In some places, it's collapsed. The battlefield is not moving in their favor. The only reason, they have lots of reasons to come to the table, but as a good faith effort, I would expect President Trump to be putting pressure on President Putin to refrain from some of these more egregious atrocities. You could also imagine why President Putin would want to agree to this, because after all, President Trump has said if Putin doesn't come around, Trump, could just walk away. And that would be a bad thing for Russia. So I suspect there's lots of pressure, both formally, explicitly, and informally, being put upon Putin, not just to refrain from some of these atrocities, but to really seriously consider a framework for a more durable solution.
Let's talk now a little bit about the makeup here of President Putin, where, I mean, he is known to really try at times to not only egg on the different entities that are involved, but also to try to continue and really showcase his efforts that are always at the heart of it, seeming denial and lying. I mean, let's just face the facts here that he is known just to lie as easy as he breathes.
Right. No, it's very plausible that this is a Putin effort to string Trump along. That's certainly what many people worry about. He lies like a rug, as my mother would say. But the flip side of it is Russia has lost hundreds of thousands of people in this war. It's increasingly isolated internationally. It's becoming a junior partner of countries like China, like North Korea, for goodness sake. Ending this conflict is increasingly in Putin's interest. And he has in the back of his mind that Trump himself may not know where he wants to go with this. So if the meeting doesn't go in the way that Trump wants, Putin, could be in a much worse position. So yes, he lies, but he also has good incentives to at least strike some kind of arrangement, to at least move the chains forward.
And moving those chains towards a hopeful off ramp to this war, what does that look like? Because we've heard that Ukraine obviously does not want anything to do with land swapping. That there was some talk maybe earlier this week that that was maybe the goal of this summit. But what does an off ramp to this war look like where Russia says, okay, enough's enough? Ukraine can also say enough is enough. What does that look like?
Right. I think it's going to involve a couple of different things. I think a freezing of the battle lines, number one, akin to what we did with the Korean armistice in 1953. That way, neither side gets to say that way Ukraine gets to say we haven't surrendered our land, even though it is effectively under Russian control. I think likewise, there needs to be a plan to provide Ukraine with the ability to defend itself going forward. I don't think that's going to involve NATO membership, even EU membership at this point, but the reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy, the Ukrainian defense industry, perhaps some kind of European security guarantees so they have some kind of faith in the long term durability of any arrangements. And then finally, some kind of way of making European security begin working again. Right now, we've seen the collapse of European security conversations where Russia's on the outs. Russia lives in Europe. It'll ultimately have to live with its neighbors in some way, shape, or form. They'll have to live with Russia. And so some kind of framework that begins moving that conversation forward. So it becomes not just about Ukraine, but Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of European security will need to take place. I think an armistice leading to progressive negotiations are the way we're going to get there.
And this comes at a time where, when we saw in the previous years, President Biden and his administration and not having conversations with Russia. And now we are seeing back the opening portal of those conversations. Again, President Trump and Putin coming together here to try to come to some sort of agreement. But at this point, does it seem that Putin has the advantage already? He's on American soil. He's back in the limelight here of international news. Does he have that advantage already?
No, I hear that argument. I don't think there's much to that argument. Statesmen, policymakers are judged by the ability of the countries they hold. And Russia has been proven in this war to be much less militarily potent, much less economically vibrant, and much less diplomatically strategic than many countries expect them to be, than they were expected to be before the war. The fact that he's in the United States actually could be seen almost as a supplicant coming to the United States seeking President Trump's help in ending the war versus the victory Putin saw in the opening days of the conflict. So I actually think by virtue of coming to the United States, Trump hasn't given anything up and he's put Putin in the requester seat.
And where do you think the respect level is from Putin to President Trump? We've heard many times President Trump says that Putin is a strong leader, that he gives them some sort of ability to be excited to be here. But what does Putin ultimately think of President Trump?
I'm not an expert on Vladimir Putin, but the fact of the matter is, I think he respects anyone who inhabits the Oval Office because whomever inhabits the Oval Office commands the U.S. military, gets oversight of the U.S. economy, and the United States is a much larger, more powerful, more potent country than Russia. So Putin may have various things to think about President Trump versus President Biden versus President Obama, but at the end of the day, he's thinking about them as leader of the United States, and we're a gosh darn powerful country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to show everyone again the room where this joint news conference is going to happen. And I was talking earlier, and I want to get your thoughts on this about how in this room, no doubt the advantage has to go to President Trump because he is so good at taking questions, both positive and negative. I mean, he really does open up his Oval Office to the media. I mean, so many times during the week. That is very different from how President Putin operates, where everything is much more controlled. And, you're not going to be pretty much setting him up for negative questions if you want to, continue to have a good life in Russia.
That's correct. And also, President Putin is kind of famous for his 3 hour long answers. He gets a question and he lectures you on the topic. I think this type of forum, this type of Q&A from the media, from an open media as well, also really plays to President Trump's advantage. I think it also puts, again, Russia on the back foot, having to confront, if not sincerely answer, real hard questions of a Russian policy.
Yeah, so true. And I'm so glad that you were here with us today, Josh, on this really historic day that will continue to be. And we'll wait for some of the remarks that come out and key details of this meeting. But, Josh, thanks so much for joining us on Live Now from Fox.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You take care. All right, everyone. We are going to continue to bring you the coverage from